Think about what you're doing. It should be like breathing if you're working outside of fear and outside of worry, and you're working in a way that is possible, where you acknowledge it's possible. Do what you know you can do to further your version and your view of the truth, and do it in a respectful way, and do it with confidence. And don't lift the burden if it's too heavy. There's someone else that'll lift it for you, or lift it with you. But do something in favor of what you believe to be right and true, whether it's on any of the issues we've covered today or on some other issue, but something that you care about, and recognize there's a billion other people doing the same thing, and we're not waiting for an organization to form. We're already standing in it. It's called the human race. Participate in it. Be what you were created to be, and assert yourself in the world today by affecting change, by direct action, in a respectful and rational way, and without fear and without worry, because that is the zone in which things can happen. Fear is the adversary. It has always been the adversary, and it's the easiest method of controlling human behavior. When you think of the whole 1984 scenarios, which I think are here now, I mean certainly are here now on steroids. I mean those guys are rolling over in their grave because it's a lot worse than they thought. Huxley, you know, he wrote Brave New World, and the essay most people missed of his was one of the very last ones he wrote, which was Brave New World Revisited. When he went back and sort of looked at it and said, oh no, it's 40 years ahead of where I thought it was. Now this is in the late 1950s, and I think he died in 62 or 63. So the very end of his life, and the things that are the most important to read aren't what somebody wrote early in their career, it's what they wrote at the end, sort of how they evaluate. You know, when I look at studying someone's work, I start with the last thing they wrote and work my way backwards, because there's the pinnacle of their knowledge. And Huxley's pinnacle of the knowledge was the last warning, the last shout in the movie theater saying, hey, it's 40 years ahead of the game, and it probably isn't going to be chemistry that does it. It's going to be something else. And it's the electronics of this century. It's the tools that we've been talking about misapplied to the population. Those are the things that are causing Huxley today to roll over in his grave, because even that warning was 40 years too old. I mean, that warning in the late 50s and his conclusion then was nothing compared to what has emerged in the 21st century and what came out of the last century. This technology to change not just our emotional states, but the way we perceive the world, already exists on the planet. New breakthroughs are being anticipated by military planners. This last year, 2010, DARPA let 2 contracts, University of California, for developing methods and means for creating electronic telepathy, where we can electronically transfer thoughts into the mind of another person in a way that they cannot distinguish the artificial from their own. Now think about that in the 21st century. If you can create a complete memory set, one of the stated goals of Air Force planners, to complete a complete memory set that you cannot distinguish the real from the fiction, is that the witness you want on your trial in the courts of the 21st century? The guy who can swear by that memory, and yet that memory is as false as a $3 bill. That's the technology of this century. It'll challenge the very institutions that we depend on for justice, for liberty, for freedom. Synthetic memory. It's being even played off in terms of Gulf War syndrome and in terms of the shock that people come out of the war with. You know, the shock, the fear, the memories, the post-traumatic stress syndrome that boils out of these war efforts. And so what are we hearing about? Ways to wipe the memory clean so people can forget all those bad experiences. Do they really go away, or do they just get driven deeper into the subconscious where they do their real work at breaking down the consciousness of a human being, where they can't get played out, they can't get worked out, they get suppressed, and suppressed conflicting ideas are the root to a lot of the psychosis we see in the world today. This is the solution of military planners. Wipe out the memory of the gladiator so they don't know what they did. And somehow that will excuse the behavior and save that person's soul. No, it won't. It'll mask the pain. and let it break out in some weird, irrational way, because that's what happens when you suppress these kinds of memories. Secondly, maybe we want these guys to remember what they did, because maybe some of the things that they were directed to do they shouldn't have done in the first place. Maybe the memories that they have of the abuses that we inflict on others are memories that somebody ought to be testifying to someday, instead of burying, because now we have a technology that can mask the behavior of our troops in combat. That's not the answer. In the past wars, the wars that our fathers fought and our grandfathers fought, when they returned from battle, the stench of death was still in their noses, and they worked hard to avoid wars in future wars, to save the next generation from experiencing the same trauma they did. Trauma is the outcome of war, but it also makes us, as human beings, resist war, make it our last effort, not our first effort. If we take it out, we make it neutral, where there's no pain, there's no residual memory. It becomes easier and easier to inflict war on others. It becomes easier and easier to use that as the solution rather than diplomacy and fair play. Is that what we want? Is that the reflection of American values we want our military, paranoid closet planners to engage in for us? Or do we want them to uphold the values, instill those values on the next generation of military planners, so that American values are what's projected to the world by our example, not by our hidden agenda? You know, thinking about Alaska strategically, and most Americans don't, but let's talk about Alaska just for a minute, and how this feeds in to what's happening around the world. Firstly, Alaska is 18% of all the land in the United States. It has a greater coastline, Alaska alone. If you take all the western states, all the west coast, all the east coast, and all the Gulf Coast, and you add it all up, Alaska's coastline is bigger. And we have a 200-mile federal limit in those coastal waters, which is significant. Now, let's look at where Alaska sits on the map. Here's Alaska. Place Alaska just for a moment as if it were the top of the world. And then look at where it sits. North America. Here's LA. The same distance to LA, I hit Japan. The same distance, I hit Northern Europe. Same distance as for me as an Alaskan to fly to Tokyo, to LA, or to Oslo. I can get there in virtually the same amount of time from Alaska, which is why Federal Express located their international hub in Anchorage, Alaska, and UPS put their international hub in Fairbanks, Alaska, because they could serve Asia, Europe, and the United States with the shortest distance between points, hubbing out of Alaska. Now, if you think about it, the Aleutian chain, which actually, you can't see it so easily on this, but it comes down right to here, and here's Japan. Okay? So Alaska to Japan is this distance. Alaska, I don't even hit Seattle. I can't get to the next state, but I can get to Japan. Now think about it. Raw materials coming out of Alaska, feeding the Pacific Rim. The best markets are to feed the Asian markets. Now there's no railroad link, so I mentioned yesterday, we can't get from Alaska into the Midwest. If we could link approximately right here at Prince Rupert, if we could link at Prince Rupert to the railroad system in Canada, we could then move Alaskan commodities all the way into the Midwest, the industrial belt, and be able to use those mineral commodities to do value-added and reindustrialize the nation. 1/4 of all the oil and gas left undiscovered in the world exists right here in the Arctic Circle. That's the estimate. Alaska has hundreds of trillions of cubic feet of natural gas. Now think about the North Slope of Alaska, which is right here where our oil and gas is. Now think about us moving oil and gas through an empty Arctic. The Arctic Sea is almost to the point where we can start to move freight from Europe to North America across the pole. Think about it. instead of bringing freight from Europe to the United States, this distance, a third of the way around the world, we can shorten that distance to a quarter of its distance and move freight directly in to Northern Europe and into their rail systems, connecting into their commodity flow, or into Russia and Asia. Jumping over the poles with our freight, not just in the air, but in the sea. This will change everything and puts Alaska in the most strategic place, because commodities are equal in price no matter where they're produced. The differences then become how cheap is it to get it to the next point. So we need rail to get it into the Midwest of the United States, where then it has the opportunity of being exported off of our western ports or through the St. Lawrence Seaway or off of our eastern ports, or we have the option in the not too distant future of shipping direct into these markets, raw goods, or adding value here in Alaska. Alaska has the greatest energy resources. All these minerals require energy for value added, and we have the opportunity to do that now. Now, what would that mean? If we began to move these commodities, these energy resources in the United States, half of our trade deficit is energy related and the other is buying value-added products back from China. If we could eliminate 50% of our trade deficits by eliminating imported energy, we strengthen the dollar again. We reinvigorate our economy again. We now have a domestic supply of energy, and we keep our money rolling in our own economies. The same is true with value added to our commodities. We have an opportunity to take a big chunk of our economy back from the rest of the world, embed it back into our nation, and use the advantage that we have. Alaska is the stepchild. Recognize our state. Recognize this place as an incredible opportunity for Americans to be liberated by looking at the balance sheet. Think about it. We always talk about the profit and loss statement, the income and expenses of the nation when we talk about the debt and how we're going to fix it. And it's always about the taxpayer and putting it on our backs. The balance sheet are the assets of the nation, which includes our energy resources, our mineral wealth, our forests, our public lands. How do we make them pay in a way that offsets the Treasury demands against the taxpayer? Get full value for our commodities. Make sure those multinationals pay money here, because here's what happens, and we play it out in Alaska every year. Here we have oil and gas that the nation needs, and we have a pipeline that can run it down to Valdez, and the pipeline is running at 616,000 barrels a day today. It's designed to handle 2.1 million